Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. The Powerhouse acknowledges the traditional custodians of the ancestral homelands upon which our museums are situated and pays respect to their elders past, present, and future, and recognizes their continuous connection to country. My name is Catherine Poltz. I'm the science producer at the Powerhouse and programmer for the Sydney Science Festival. Throughout National Science Week, we've been broadcasting live conversations with experts to address some of society's biggest challenges and the positive contributions made by science and scientists, covering everything from First Nation science, oceans, climate change, coronavirus, and computing technology, and astronomy. If you've missed us earlier in the week, you can catch our on-demand programs until the end of the month on sydneyscience.mas.museum. Today is the last day of the festival, and we have a special program to end on, a conversation between our astronomy ambassador, Karlie Noon, and Dr. Chanda Prescod-Weinstein, a cosmologist and author of The Disordered Cosmos, A Journey into Dark Matter, Space-Time, and Dreams Deferred. It's incredible work that will change how you think about science and its practice, and we have a promo at the museum store where you can get 20% off until the end of the month using SSF 21. I'll now introduce Karlie to start the program. Karlie Noon is a Gomeroi astronomer and science communicator who's worked with audiences around the country promoting Indigenous astronomical knowledge systems and advocating for women in STEM. Karlie was the first Indigenous female to obtain degrees in physics and mathematics and is currently completing a PhD looking at the gas dynamics of the Milky Way galaxy at the Australian National University. A multiple award winner, Karlie was the 2019 ACT Young Australian of the Year finalist and a Eureka Prize Emerging Leader finalist. She is the host of the new highly recommended ABC podcast Cosmic Vertigo and is Sydney Observatory's inaugural astronomy ambassador. Welcome, Karlie.
Thank you so much, Catherine. As always, it is my absolute pleasure to be your host for this incredible event to wrap up the 2021 Sydney Science Festival. And it is such an honour to introduce our fabulous guest, Dr. Chanda Prescod-Weinstein. She is an assistant professor of physics and astronomy and core faculty in women's and gender studies at the University of New Hampshire. Her research in theoretical physics focuses on cosmology, neutron stars, and dark matter. She also does research in Black feminist science, technology, and society studies. Nature recognized her as one of the 10 people in the world who shaped science in 2020. And Essence magazine has recognized her as one of 15 Black women who are paving the way in STEM and breaking barriers. A co-founder of Particles for Justice, she received the 2017 LGBT plus Physicist Acknowledgement of Excellence Award for her contributions to improving conditions for marginalized people in physics. And in 2021, American Physical Society Edward A. Budget Award for her contributions to particle cosmology. Originally from East LA, she divides her time between the beautiful New Hampshire seacoast and Cambridge, Massachusetts. Yama, as us Gomeroi people over here say, hello, Dr. Chanda. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to talk to you, Karlie.
Me too. I think, we've both been really, really excited about this event. There's been a little bit of buzz around it as well with other people. I think we both have similarities within our own journeys. And I think also, there's so many similarities and differences between Australia and America and say what it looks like to be a female astronomer in these different countries. So definitely a lot of excitement today about this event. Thank you so much for being here. Now, to kick things off, you have recently released this incredible book. Where is it? I have it here. This incredible book. I've read it 1.5 times already. I read the entire book before this event was even conceived of. As soon as it came out, I had to read it. It's a phenomenal book, The Disordered Cosmos, and it's described as an exploration of dark matter, space-time, and dreams deferred. Can you tell us a little bit about how these topics, how they're covered in your book, how they relate to each other, and why did you take that particular approach with the structure of your book?
Yeah, so this is a big and also, I guess, for me as a lit nerd, interesting question, in the sense that um, in many ways, the book that I ended up writing is not the book that I set out to write or thought that I was going to write. And one of the comments that I want to make to all of like the young scientists out there is that writing is often how you find out what you think. And in many ways, the book told me about itself as I was on the journey of writing it. So I put together a proposal, took it around to publishers, made a deal with a publisher. And so a lot of the things that I told the publishers that I was going to do ended up in the book. But the one thing that actually ended up being different is when I actually sat down to write it, I realized I really wanted to include chapters that talked about my science. So the book was originally envisioned as kind of a commentary on science, and it was actually meant to be kind of like a physical paper publication, and with some updates of essays that I've been publishing on my blog and in other places online. And so and I think this is one of the reasons my agent was able to convince me to do it, is that it seemed kind of like, oh, I'm just going to be editing stuff I've already done and putting and compiling stuff that I've already done. And then actually it ended up being something, I think like when I left, so for people in Australia who don't know what East LA is East Los Angeles. And so when I left East LA, which was at the time like a working class, primarily Mexican American, Central American, and immigrant community, my dream was to write my own A Brief History of Time. And I wanted to come home to East LA with my own A Brief History of Time in my hands. And when I realized that I was just going to be writing a book talking about everything that was broken about science, I was really kind of confronted with my own dream deferred, and deferred by the way that my trajectory through science had been shaped by my ascribed identities, like the way I was racialized, the way that I am socially gendered, my own internal sense of sexual orientation and gender identity. And I wanted to make sure that I could live some of that dream in the book. I'll be honest and say that that's part of what happened. I think like in the end, the second half of the book, where I'm extremely critical of science and how science is done, I think becomes more compelling for audiences because you've first seen my excitement for the science. And so it's hard to walk away from the book being like, she's anti-science, which I think is like the risk when you're critical, is that people are like, oh, you just hate science. And I'm like, there's no way you can read the first like half of this book and walk away thinking I don't like it. Right.
Yeah. There's also the risk of, people just giving up on science completely, right? When you are presented with some really overwhelming challenges in a field, and when we haven't really been able to talk about it before, I think there is a risk that people just will want to wipe their hands off it. And I think, unfortunately, we don't live in a society where we can do that anymore. Science is far too ingrained within everything we do.
I think science is ingrained structurally in the world that we live in, and there's so much power attached to science as a set of tools, as a discourse, as a label, and it's also the case that the world that we live in calls for activities that we might label as science or as scientific activities. And we're all living through this pandemic right now. I know that originally this conversation was meant to be beamed into an auditorium, and it couldn't be because as is unfolding in the US, Sydney is struggling with COVID. And I think it's also the Delta variant there as well.
Yeah.
And it's also become clear throughout this pandemic that who has access to the resources to deal with even receiving a diagnosis, getting sick, getting access to vaccinations, et cetera, is shaped by social phenomena. And whether people in our communities are there at the table of power to advocate for making sure that, you know, here in the Black American community and Black immigrant communities in the United States, to make sure that people are talking about, well, what's the best way to make sure that Black folks are getting the vaccination? That people made sure that, you know, Native American tribes were able to get access to doses that they could exclusively provide to their communities, to their tribal members and citizens. So it matters whether we're at the table for these scientific conversations for public health reasons, for medical reasons. And so you might say, okay, but what does that have to do with astronomy? What does that have to do with particle physics? But of course, you know, there are a couple of things here, which is like one of the ways that you get little kids interested in science, and some of them break off and go into medicine and public health and pharmaceutical research and all of that, is they get excited by astronomy. They get excited by particle physics. We are, like you actually are, we are ambassadors for science. And we sort of open people's eyes to how science and the scientific method can be exciting. So it really does matter, you know, what do particle physicists, what do astronomers look like? I think that that's a really key piece. You know, there's a whole other conversation to be had about whether science should have the power that it has in the ways that it does. But the fact is that it does. And so we need to be able to participate in that conversation and have facility with those tools, even if the point is that we want to push back against bad power relations.
Yeah, I think another thing definitely relevant to us Indigenous peoples here in Australia, you know, we have a saying, always was, always will be. And the next part of that saying is Aboriginal land. You know, we very much conceive the entire Australia, and whether we're talking about land, whether we're talking about the skies, whether we're talking about water, you know, the entire thing, you know, is very much conceived of as our land, and land that we have to take care of and be custodians of. And so when, you know, we talk about things like scientific endeavors and how it affects say Indigenous people or people of a minority, you know, there are many ways in which it can affect. If we're talking from an Indigenous perspective, in Australia, everything is happening on Indigenous land. When we talk about the sky, I think this becomes even more relevant because we all own the sky, right? We all have our own connection to the sky. And if we are affecting that, if anyone is affecting that or changing that, that's going to impact all of us. So I don't like this idea that science or astronomy or particle physics or, you know, any of these things are off in their own little world that don't have any consequences for anyone else, because clearly that's not the case. You know, this work can have huge consequences for everyone living on this planet. So I think that's a really nice reminder. I also just want to pick up, my heart did a little bit of a flutter when you were saying, you know, you wanted to go back home and take your own version of A Brief History of Time. I almost cried when you said that, because that book is genuinely what got me into science and what got me into physics. And as soon as I put that book down, I was 19, and it was my first exposure to physics. I had no idea what it was before that, and was never allowed to know what it was. You know, I wasn't allowed to go to the physics class. That was for the boys and, you know, the really well-off kids. And so to hear that, you know, to have your own version of it, that's absolutely beautiful. And honestly, I think it's maybe not quite what was produced in this book, but it adds so much to, I think, what we need right now in our respective communities. So Yeah, thank you for that. I want to get on to a little bit about the science, right? I could very much relate to when you are in these places, in these intersections, and you have to represent different communities. You can become a little bit weighed down and forget why you do it. What is the point of doing all this work? So I would love to hear you talk a little bit about maybe some really cool stuff that you're working on in the moment. And if you could give us maybe a little bit of an understanding as to your understanding of what dark matter is.
Yeah, so dark matter is a good place to start because basically my scientific life revolves around dark matter. um, I do a little bit of research with like neutron stars, but it always comes back to I'm interested in using neutron stars as a laboratory for looking for dark matter. So I want everybody who's watching with us right now to think about the assumptions that we make about what stuff in the universe is made of. So probably everybody's heard we're all star stuff. And we are literally actually all made of, well, at least like dead star stuff. We're like star compost, maybe is the way to put it. But actually, the stuff that we consider to be normal, things that we can see in the universe, whether it's stars, whether it's the desk in front of me or the computer or phone that you're using to watch this stream right now, that's actually the unusual stuff in the universe. I like to tell people that the stuff that we can see is actually, we are the cosmic weirdos. And the universe is mostly full of stuff that we can't see. And so actually most of the matter energy content in the universe is comprised of dark matter and dark energy. And basically those are two things. We have good evidence for their existence, but we also have no idea what they actually are. So I also hope that there are some young folks who are like, wait a minute, what? These are problems you can work on. These are problems that maybe you're going to be the one to solve. So in the case of dark matter in particular, the reason that we first felt certain that it was out there is when you look at a galaxy, and I think Karlie would be a good expert to talk about this because you're studying gas dynamics in the Milky Way for your PhD. When we look at a galaxy, we can measure how much mass is in the galaxy by how much the stars are radiating. And then we can also measure how much mass is in the galaxy by looking at how fast stars are rotating around the galactic center. And you would think that those two measurements would give you the same answer, but actually they don't. The stars actually move as if there's a lot more matter there than what we're seeing. So this is our first hint that there is some kind of invisible matter out there. And then for historical reasons, it's called dark matter. But I think if you take nothing else away from the scientific discussion here, it's invisible. It's invisible matter. Light goes right through it. Light doesn't seem to interact with it. If it does, it's on such a small scale that we haven't been able to see it. And so that's the dark matter problem. And I'm biased, but I think it's one of the most important problems in all of physics.
Yeah, I recently sat in on a discussion. So we have National Science Week over here at the moment, and of course the Sydney Science Festival. So everyone's talking about science at the moment in Australia. And sorry, excuse my dogs, they're getting a bit worked up. And someone was saying dark matter and the discovery or the understanding that we actually don't know what's out there. The majority of stuff we don't know what it is, was the biggest discovery in science and physics, because that shows us how much we don't know and how much we still have to learn. Does that make you excited about science? The fact that we don't know so much, or that we could potentially find out?
I definitely, especially since it's Science Week, I think something that it's good to remind people is that science is not about what we know. Science is in a lot of ways, the practice of science is about what we don't know. the job of a scientist really is to exist on the boundary of what humans understand about the universe and what humans don't understand about the universe, and try and push the boundary of what is known a little bit further outward. And so I think that being confused is a big part of being a scientist. And, I think a lot of times for folks who are starting graduate programs or making progress in their graduate programs, that can be like one of the big shocks about being a graduate student, right? It's like you're spending a lot of time not being sure what the results are going to be or not being sure what to do next. And it's like, yes, welcome to doing science, right? So if you're confused, you're having a very scientist experience.
Okay.
I think it's so exciting that there's still so much that we don't know about the universe, and that first of all, that means that there's opportunities and there's jobs. I come from a working class background where, like, I knew nobody was going to take care of me when I hit adulthood, that I was responsible for making, my own salary. Not that my family didn't care about me, but like nobody had that kind of cash. So it is a real privilege to be a storyteller of the universe. And I think that is what we do in the end. And I just want to, connect that back to a comment that you were just making about, the sky and the land. And particularly, I'm pushing people who, like me, come from a context of entirely like being trained within like Eurocentric traditions or traditionally European ways of looking at the world, that we have been trained to see the sky and the earth as completely separate. But in some sense, like the lesson of cosmology, the area of physics that I work in, is that there is a continuity there. Even, in these arguments about like, what does it mean? Where is the boundary of the atmosphere before you're in outer space? We've been talking about this a lot because we have these like billionaires who should pay their taxes, but aren't flying off into space. But have they actually gone to space, or have they just gone to the upper atmosphere, right? So I agree with you that it's also an incredible opportunity to transform our relationship with. So one word is seeing the world, but not everybody is sighted. So I just want to say transform our relationship with how we experience the world, right?
Yeah, I think you really captured something there. Not everyone is sighted. So to say, to see how we see the world, again, that doesn't, even if we're changing that and we're trying to have a more or a less, say, Eurocentric understanding of our world, our universe, our cosmos, historically not everyone has been seen. And even with those changes, we have to be aware of who is being included and who is not, and who historically has not. I think that's absolutely beautiful. Thank you for that. What has the response been? Right, this book is meaty, and it challenges science and it critiques it, and it does so in an informed, educated, sophisticated way. It does it in a way that it takes in our histories, our collective histories, and makes many, many, many brilliant points along the way. Has there been any pushback from that, from, say, the scientific community or the general public?
One of the things that I don't think I adequately prepared myself for before the book came out was how many people were going to come to the book with their science anxiety and their anxiety about math. I think, for example, a lot of people who had the experience that you did of being given the impression that the physics classroom wasn't for them, or people who even earlier, were walked away from something saying like, oh, I'm not a math person, I don't have the head for math, kind of this fixed intelligence stuff, which is like actually out of sync with what we know about how brains work, right? But a lot of that hasn't filtered into the way that at least here in the US, the way that students are taught. People are still taught with the kind of like, oh, you're an art person, you're a science person. Occasionally someone is both, but most people's brains don't work like that, right? So I think that one piece of the reception that I had to kind of make adjustments for was that there were people who came to the book and I think experienced a kind of like panic in reading the science sections. And then people would say, like, I read it, I didn't understand like any of it. And then they would be like, oh yeah, so there was this thing like about quarks. And I would be like, but you know the word quark now, right? and having to help people understand there's no test at the end. I mean, I don't know if there is a test. The test is like, how do you go out into the world and relate to the world after engaging with the ideas in the book, right? But nobody's testing to see like whether you can write down a definition of a quark or a neutron or a proton, or like how many up quarks and down quarks are in a neutron versus a proton. The point is for you to see it as a taster, right? And so I think that that was something that I had to be more aware of. And, you know, it's my first book, but I think that that was really a learning experience for me. And that I think like maybe, you know, in my community of people who were supporting me through this writing process, it wasn't something that any of us really talked about or that came up. And I think part of that is that we didn't really realize how many people who really would never pick up a popular science book were going to pick up this book and try. And it's sort of, I guess I will say, like, you know, there's kind of an error there in my part in that I actually wanted the book to be picked up by people who usually don't pick up popular science books. And so I mean, yes, I'm advertising my book, but I really want to take a moment to just talk about the cover, which has this face with the cosmos in it, right? And it looks like it might be someone who's African descended, right? And it's dark and the hair is curly. It's what we would call in the US like type 4 hair, right? I was very purposeful in choosing that cover because I wanted it to speak to Black people in particular and say the cosmos is in you, the cosmos belongs to you, and this book belongs to you, and this book was written with you in mind. And I think I should also say, you know, just coming back to the title, the subtitle, A Journey into Dark Matter, Space-Time, and Dreams Deferred, that Black American audiences will recognize Dreams Deferred as a reference to one of our great poets, Langston Hughes. And so there were a lot of different ways that I was trying to build in, this is a book for you in a way that popular science books, particularly about physics, have never been for Black people before. So your question was about reception, and I think that it worked, and that people who wouldn't usually picked up the book. But then also, I think we had to deal with the fact that then people were like, I don't know if I can do this, or I don't know if I read that section correctly. And there were other people who were like, you know what, I just wasn't interested in that part. And I'm like, all right, well, I'm gonna have to try with you for book number 2. I'm not giving up.
Sure.
So I think the reception for me has been a learning experience, and I'm grateful for that opportunity to learn and to connect with people.
Yeah, I think one of the first things I had spoken about after I had read this book, and I was actually talking to Catherine from the Powerhouse and the Observatory about it, because we were both, fangirling over it, and we're just so excited to read it because it is so relevant. It's relevant in Australia, and I think it's relevant worldwide, the stuff that you're talking about here. And I was saying, prepare yourself. You will get a really meaty science education experience at the start. You're going to be learning some pretty hardcore theoretical physics, and for me that was really exciting, but I thought, not everyone's going to be a nerd like me and is going to be so excited to get access to this this level of understanding. So I thought, that was something that I did. I was like, you're going to get science, just so you know. don't think you're not
It
going to
is
get
a science book at the end of the day. Yeah. I mean, it's a science book for general audiences, but it is for people who are interested in science in part. Yes.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, often our work, when we are doing advocacy work, and actually this takes me back to your introduction. At the beginning of the show, I had said your work is in theoretical physics. You focus on cosmology, neutron stars, dark matter, and you also do research in Black feminist science, technology, and society studies. I really see those two things as being so intrinsically connected. Your work in both of these or all of these different spaces, and they're so connected and feed into each other. But often, in our Western world, we like to split everything off and have them in nice, neat little boxes where they don't kind of connect. But of course, in the real world, that's not how things work. And so I think it's a really great reminder that not only are scientists people, right? We're real people that exist with thoughts, but we're not all white men, and this space is a particular space that is set up for that one type of person. And actually, when we come into it from different backgrounds or different ways of looking at the cosmos, our experiences are going to be very, very different there. Now, I want to read a quote from the book. There's this, and honestly, it was so hard to pick quotes from this book because there's just so many. And, it's just so, for a book that deals with such incredible cutting edge science, it's also a book that's incredibly grounded and real. So the one quote that I want to reference here. Now, you say there's the universe and then there's the process of developing a mathematical understanding of it. This is the physics, and the physics is a human process. Physics is not the universe. Rather, it is one very human attempt to get at its innards. And I think this beautifully speaks to what you were just saying. When you presented your science at the start of that book, it was really our attempt to understand what's going on. And again, it's a story, right? Just like we tell stories outside of science. In physics, we have our laws, and our laws help us tell our stories from that. Now, I want to talk about, your background and your upbringing, and who you are as a person, everything that entails. These are factors that, again, as I was saying, are not often backgrounds or identities that are often represented in these spaces. And you really touch on that, and you really acknowledge in your book, before you came into this space, there really was no one to look up to, or who had kind of done this path before, who had gone on this road before. So I really want to talk about, I know once you get into these spaces, we focus so much on getting into the space. But of course, we both know once you get in, those barriers, they're still there, and they don't magically disappear, unfortunately.
Yes.
So I want to know, what has kept you in this space? What has kept you facing those barriers and coming back again and again in a space that can be, quite isolating, particularly for women of color and for Black people in general? How have you dealt with that?
I think it's okay to have an array of tools at your disposal and an array of reasons at your disposal. So there have definitely been moments where it's been spite. And spite in like sort of a superficial way, and also spite in a kind of deep way, in that I don't think that we can leave the night sky to a small subset of the population that has traditionally been on the winning end of white supremacist settler colonialism. I think that means that we leave power relations intact, that we cannot leave intact. And so, I say spite superficially, like it can't just always be white guys in the classroom, but like also genuinely, it can't always be white guys in the classroom. It can't always be white, heterosexual, cisgender white guys in the classroom. I think it's also important to say that someone of a different set of identities being in the room doesn't necessarily mean that those power relations have changed, right? And so I want to be really careful about, I don't want anyone walking away thinking that I'm saying that, well, as long as there's a woman in the room, it's all good. Or even as long as there is a Black woman, whether we're talking about someone who is Indigenous to Australia, or someone who's African descended, that automatically shifts the power relations, because representation is not necessarily a shift in power relations, right? But I think that if we bring ourselves and our ancestors into the room with us, and a desire for liberation for the people who come from our ancestors, that we can be part of a shift in power relations, and that we should be bringing ourselves and our ancestors to the table of thinking about the night sky and thinking about particle physics. And so I think that that's also, that starts to move away from spite, and it starts to move in the direction of what is my responsibility to my ancestors, and what is the dialogue that I'm continuously in. And I want to say, like, I bring that up, and like, look, I don't think I've ever heard a white scientist talk about their ancestors, like in a discussion about a book or a discussion about science or anything like that.
Yeah, definitely.
That's part of what can be different about us bringing that to the table. I want to be clear, I don't necessarily mean anything supernatural by that. Maybe some people will, right? And so I also think that part of the role that my book plays and that I play is, hopefully I am widening the scope of who there is space for and what kinds of conversations there is room for, even if I'm not the one, like, I'm not going to be the person to talk to about Indigenous cosmologies. That's not my area of expertise. It's not my ministry. But I do hope that my book makes the case for why we need to respect that that is some people's ministries, and that there is something to be learned there. And that room has to be there. So those are all things that have in different ways kept me at the table, because this is a value that I hold about how science should be done. I also just really like doing math. And I'm still completely fascinated and mystified by this sort of borderline physics, philosophy, math question. Why is it that math is so good at describing the universe? I'm still I've been there since I was a little kid, and I'm still just really excited by that. And but I think it's okay to be motivated by different things. And so I want, folks to know also that if you're finding that you have a different set of motivations, as long as they are oriented toward, us all living in better relations with each other, your motivation doesn't have to be the same as mine. I just want us to get to being in better relations with each other.
Yeah. And I think with that comes the acceptance of different motivations, right? Instead of just having that same, I had a very similar motivation getting in. I completely agree. Maths is magical to me, and it always has been, and it always will. Not in the sense that, you put something in and then it gives you the right answer. Not so much that we can so beautifully and accurately describe our world with this language. That's what I find really magical about it. And so, that's what motivated me. But that's not enough to keep me in there. When you are dealing with certain barriers, when you can't even get remotely to the table, it's this distant, far off dream that you really have very little access to. Your love for that just sometimes isn't enough, as it maybe would be for someone who maybe doesn't have to experience as many barriers getting to that same place. I can completely relate to you when, talking about bringing your ancestors with you. I think that's a beautiful way to ground yourself in your work that you're doing, right? And I think we all have the capabilities to do this, because it takes the pressure off you a little bit, in a way. For me, at least, it has. It's not so much about what I have to do, or what I think I have to achieve or I should be achieving. It's about what's going to make me happy. And really, at the end of the day, what's going to make me happy is what I know I would be proud to take back home to my community, take back home to my family, tell to my ancestors. And so I think that's a really, really beautiful reminder for all of us. In the Indigenous world, this is our bread and butter, right? Everything we do, our ancestors are behind, and we're walking with our ancestors the whole way. So I think that's just a really great reminder for everyone, that we can be engaging in these types of conversations with ourselves and having this type of reflection. Now, I want to talk a little bit about who can be a scientist, right? And I think this is really at the crux of both of the work that you have been doing and really trailblazing, and the work that I've certainly been giving a go here in Australia. Now, I'm going to say some other quotes from the book that I think really capture the essence of where we're at in the scientific community at the moment. So you say in your book, Disordered Cosmos, we are rare and precious, and part of our burden is we must craft our own sense of belonging, because we are in spaces where no Black woman scientist has gone before. Now, I know this is especially true for yourself and your journey, but I also know that it's especially true for many Black women here in this country. Now, I proudly represent my culture and my heritage, and if anybody knows me, they know that I will happily talk at length about it. But of course, whilst I consider myself Aboriginal, I am certainly not a woman of colour. I am very white appearing, and this has definitely given me many privileges in my life. So when I think about, having more representation in the world of science, or in the world of astronomy or physics, I think, despite maybe me being somewhere in that space and maybe a few other people being somewhere in that space, we still have so much work to go. And I think it's really important to be clear with that, right? Whilst I may represent my Gomeroi community and my heritage, I certainly don't represent the experience of being a woman of colour. I want to talk a little bit about this idea. Now, you have a whole chapter in your book on the topic, the science of melanin, which absolutely blew my mind. And I think it really speaks to the benefit of having people with different ways of viewing the world come into science and to be thinking about these things, because you introduced me to something that I really had no understanding of. I want to talk about this concept of Blackness and melanin within science. Do you see that as a space that is, going in a positive direction? Do you feel that it is also potentially a space that is maybe being a bit gatekept in some way? I know from the Australian Indigenous perspective, there has been some tensions online around Indigenous Australians' use of the term black and blackness and identifying themselves as black, which is a really common and historical thing that has evolved here in order to recognize the horrific policies that our families and our ancestors unfortunately have endured, and sadly our communities are still enduring today. I just want to get an understanding. There's we can widen representation and we can have more people in here, but I really want to get to this idea around blackness and how it can be used and how it can also be misused possibly.
Yeah, so I think it's important for both of us to have this conversation, as I think in the terms that we would use in the United States as light-skinned women. And specifically, in an American context, when we say light skin, it's with acknowledgement that your heritage is not entirely European, but that you're literally, you have less melanin in your skin than other people from your community. And so the physics of melanin was an interesting chapter to work on, because I was both really interested in kind of like the scientific questions of like, how does, the absorption of the actual molecule work? How is it interacting with photons, right? The super nerdy, like physicist, what is in some sense, the quantum mechanics of melanin questions, right? And then even learning that the structure of the biomolecule maybe allows us to do interesting material science research that can give insight into superconductors. So there's all this like cool stuff happening, but at the same time having to reckon with, when I look at melanin, pardon me, when I look at melanin and I'm like, there's this cool science stuff happening. And then I know that when police officers are looking at varying levels of melanin, that often something else is going on, right? When white supremacists are looking at melanin, we know something else is going on, right? And I couldn't talk about the cool science stuff without also talking about that. And so that had to be attended to. And that also required attending to, what is my own specific positionality as someone who is light-skinned. And even talking about what are the stories we tell ourselves about why people look the way that they do, and what are the beliefs that we have when we look at someone about how they came to look that way. And so, for example, having to explain that my mother's parents are both Black, but my mother is also a relatively light-skinned person. Her father and I were about the same shade. His parents were both Black. So I have a white father. But the story is complicated by the legacy of slavery and the legacy of rape during slavery. And also sometimes miscegenation, mixed marriages that were not about rape, but were actually like people falling in love with each other, because that's what happens when people come into contact, is that occasionally people actually like each other, and it's not all just like violence and guns, although there's a lot of that too often, right? And I think that all comes to the table. And I think, when you come from a community that has been so harmed and so marginalized by the colonial violence of subtler colonialism, as has happened in Africa, and of literally having your body colonized, as has happened to those of us in the Black Atlantic and our ancestors in the Black Atlantic. My understanding of history where you are is that both of those things were happening. That there was settler colonialism. There were also things that to me look a lot like slavery, even if it wasn't always called that. And that there are opportunities for us to draw links with each other. through shared understandings of history and heritages and desires for liberation, to be freed from white supremacist settler colonialism. But I think that when you come from a community that's been so marginalized, it can be very easy to just be very focused on what is happening to you and to your community. And it's a completely understandable thing. It's a completely understandable thing. And so I think sometimes, and also in the larger context of like American hegemony, sometimes people are like, well, we use this word, this is our word. But I have to recognize that when I go to Australia, the context for people there is Australia, not what's happening in the United States, right? And so if Black, and specifically like Blackfella is a word that people are taking for themselves, for their community in a reclamation kind of way, because the British used it in a particular way, then what I see there is not someone stealing from me, but someone who has been through something that I can identify with. And I hope that there's power in that. That means that we can have a conversation about what we're going to do about these colonizers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think you make such a great point that, the issue we are really talking about here are these regimes and these policies and this behavior and, white supremacy in general, and the consequences that we, now have to live with and try and function within. It's not so much, people that are actively implementing this kind of stuff today. Sometimes it certainly does happen, and we certainly see that in Australia. Some of these things are still being carried out today, unfortunately, but generally, we are talking about stopping the continuation of it, or even just people trying to help people be able to see these power relationships that are happening. And I think, what this has ultimately created is we do have our communities that, our respective communities and many other communities around the world who have gone through this incredibly immense battle for sovereignty, for agency, for land, for language, for culture, for anything that, is theirs, that has been perhaps stolen or taken away from them. And so, we are seeing, people get really defensive and protective of those communities. And I completely agree. It's so understandable.
Yes.
And at times it's really needed, and it is a really appropriate reaction. But of course, we are now learning that we all have these really unique histories around the world, and we have kind of been kept away from each other for a while, I think. And of course, we now have, we have these different apps, we have these different social media platforms where we are connecting, and we are, slowly understanding the joint histories we have, even though, there hasn't been a physical connection there. There has certainly been some theoretical and policy connections there and historical connections there. So I think this is actually a really kind of an exciting time for our respective communities, right? And to be understanding our histories and, understanding that we are kind of in this together and we have that same goal.
I mean, I definitely, I think, one of the things that I realized I didn't say that I try and contend with in the chapter and talking about, what's my social location, and even just coming back to us as light-skinned people, is, the phenomenon of colorism, which is that some people experience worse racism than other people. And it is very strongly shaped by skin color, hair texture, the shape of your nose, like all of these things that people might think, oh, it's kind of crass to point that out. But we also know that shapes like who gets targeted for incarceration, who's more likely to be targeted, who is less likely to be presumed to be stupid in a scientific setting, in all of these kinds of things. And One of the comments that I want to make about this, for is about the power that we have to, first of all, notice that those phenomena are happening across oceans. Colonialism in some ways looks like colonialism. But also, just coming back to the question you were asking earlier about representation, the power that we have as people who have been able to get into the room is that sometimes, because people react to you differently, because they might think, oh, she'll be easier to manage because she's not like the other ones, or whatever their thought process is that you get to get away with things sometimes that other people can't get away with. And I think it is actually our task and our responsibility. And this comes back to being in conversation with our ancestors, that we have power in the room. It is our task and our responsibility to not be managed, because there's incentive from white supremacy to be manageable, right? And so I just think that's a really important thing to point to, is that colorism is real, and we can choose to upend its function when we see that people think that they can use us to make it work for them. I think that that's like a really important piece of it, right?
Yeah, that's some really incredible insight. Goodness. So we are running out of time. I don't want to admit it. I don't want to acknowledge it, but we are. I think we could easily talk for hours, and hopefully we will get to do that one day. My last question. Now, at the observatory, I've spent a year with this team here. It's been absolutely phenomenal. And we have spent so much time and work and effort trying to connect people to our beautiful skies, our beautiful southern sky that we have here. I want to know, do you think access and connection to the sky is important for modern day people?
Absolutely. And I think that, I just want to come back again to specifically thinking about this in the context of holding up Indigenous communities, like here where I am, Abenaki and Wabanaki communities, that a lot of cosmologies don't see the distinction between the land and the sky. And so returning people to being able to have that holistic conception is really important. Mm-hmm. It is also the case that for all of us, regardless of where your people are from 500 years ago or before, our species evolved under the night sky. And until fairly recently, everyone on the planet had pretty easy access to a dark night sky. It's only very recently that not everybody has access to a dark night sky. And I do think it's really important for people to think about how that is transforming our understanding of ourselves and our sense of responsibility to our ecosystems. And I think that it has harmed our sense of responsibility to our ecosystems. And I also think it has harmed our ability to access awe on a regular basis. I don't think you have to believe in the supernatural or be church going or be spiritual to experience awe. You just have to see the Milky Way. And if you don't experience awe, you just have to hear the Milky Way. However you access sensory, it's impossible not to be awestruck by it. And so I think that can motivate us to be at our best with each other, but that requires all of us having access to that experience. And if you think about what it means for people to get access to a dark night sky, to a radio quiet environment, to hear the night sky, it requires radical rethinking of our land use, of making sure that everybody has the wheelchair that they need, if that's what they need for their mobility, that it's hard to feel awe when you're hungry. It's hard to feel awe when you're being poisoned by water that has been harmed by a water supply that's been harmed by mining. We need to radically re-envision society in order to get that access to that dark night sky. And that dark night sky is part of who we are.
So beautiful. need to take a nice breath out after that. What can I say? I think that is a really excellent point to wrap things up. A really great reminder that awe is really important for all of us, not just our Indigenous people, or not just our spiritual people, but for all of us. We can all experience that awe, and the sky is a really phenomenal way to do that, but of course we don't all have access to it. Now I'm going to wrap things up, sadly. Dr. Chanda, thank you so much for being here on behalf of the entire Sydney Science Festival, the Powerhouse Museum, the Observatory, and of course myself. I really just want to thank you so much for being here today. But I also especially want to thank you for writing this book and for literally all of the work that you do. Now, this conversation and many other Sydney Science Festival programs can be viewed on demand until the end of August at sydneyscience.mass.museum. But for now, that is all from us. This is Karlie Noon signing off. Thank you so much. See you soon. Yalu, everyone.
Thank you.